What you are about to hear is not a work of fiction. This is a collected narrative, pieced together from historical records, court transcripts, police archives, and first-hand accounts, presented with the sole purpose of delivering the most accurate and complete information to you, the listener. Our aim is to educate, to reveal the stark realities of a forgotten chapter in American crime. So, if you're ready for a story so brutal it forced the mighty Al Capone himself to step back, then listen closely. This is the truth behind the legends. Subscribe now, hit the notification bell, and prepare to journey into the heart of darkness that was Prohibition-era Detroit. This is the story of the Purple Gang. In the choked, smoky air of Detroit's Lower East Side, in the shadow of the booming automotive industry, a different kind of engine was being forged, one that would soon drive the city into an unprecedented era of terror and bloodshed. This is where the Purple Gang was born, not in boardrooms or secret society meetings, but in the gritty, crowded streets of the Hastings Street neighborhood, a vibrant and impoverished melting pot of Eastern European Jewish immigrants. The year is 1918. The world is reeling from war and flu, but for a group of adolescent boys, street toughs with names like Abe Bernstein, his brothers Joe and Raymond, Eddie Fletcher, and a young hothead named Sammy Cohen, the chaos was not a tragedy but an opportunity. They were the children of tailors, peddlers, and dreamers who had fled persecution only to find hardship in America's industrial heartland. Rejecting the grinding poverty of their parents, they turned their entrepreneurial spirit toward the streets, beginning with petty theft, shoplifting, and shakedowns of pushcart vendors. They earned their enigmatic name, the Purple Gang, not from any regal aspiration, but reportedly from a remark by a Hastings street shopkeeper who, watching the motley crew pass by, muttered to a cop, "They're off color." Like a purple gang. The label, meant as an insult, would soon become a brand of pure dread. What set these teenagers apart was not just their ruthlessness, but their unique identity. They were outsiders in the world of organized crime, a Jewish crew in a landscape dominated by Italian and Irish mobsters, and this otherness bred a fierce, insular loyalty and a willingness to be far more vicious than their competitors. Their first major foray was the clean racket, hijacking shipments of expensive clothes from railway freight cars and selling the loot through a network of fences. They operated with a shocking impunity, protected in part by their youth. Authorities often saw them as mere delinquents, and by a growing reputation for unpredictable, savage violence against anyone who crossed them. The turning point from street gang to criminal enterprise arrived with a thunderclap, the Volstead Act of 1920. Prohibition did not create the Purple Gang, but it handed them the blueprint for an empire. Overnight, Detroit, with its riverfront facing the wide-open liquor stores of Canada, became the most critical bootlegging gateway in North America. The Purple Gang, already skilled hijackers, saw the potential instantly. They didn't bother with the messy business of brewing or distilling. They specialized in theft, transport, and wholesale murder. They began by hijacking Canadian whiskey shipments right off the boats, using speedboats and fast cars, and then selling the liquid gold to other, larger syndicates. It was a wholesale operation, and their biggest customer became none other than the outfit in Chicago, run by Alphonse Capone. Capone, a shrewd businessman, recognized the value of these ruthless, efficient suppliers. He preferred to do business with them rather than fight them, a tacit acknowledgement of their ferocity that would become legendary. By the mid-1920s, the Purples had evolved. No longer just hijackers, they established their own breweries in Detroit, protected by a web of corrupt police and politicians. They muscled in on the cleaning and dyeing trade, the gambling rackets, and the unions. Their headquarters shifted from street corners to the swanky Milaflores apartments on Collingwood Avenue and the luxurious Hotel St. Clair, where they held court like princes of the underworld. They dressed in the finest suits, drove the most expensive cars, and flashed rolls of cash that could choke a horse. But beneath this glossy veneer of success was a core of psychopathic brutality. They ruled not through complex codes of honor, but through sheer, unadulterated terror. A rival's slight wasn't met with a warning. It was met with a public, grotesque execution designed to send a message to the entire city. They pioneered the use of the Thompson submachine gun, the Chicago typewriter, in criminal warfare, understanding its psychological and literal power to erase problems. They became the adjudicators of the Detroit underworld, the violent enforcers hired by other mobs to settle disputes, a role that gave them immense power and made them universally feared. By 1927, this collection of street urchins from the Lower East Side, now men in their late 20s, controlled Detroit. They were not just participants in the criminal economy, they were its governors. Every truck of illicit alcohol that moved, every dice game that operated, every union vote that was cast, did so with the Purple Gang's permission, paid for with a tribute of cash or blood. Their rise was meteoric, a trajectory fueled by Prohibition's absurd economics and a complete absence of moral restraint. They stood at the pinnacle, looking down on a city of over 1 million people that they held in the palm of their blood-stained hands, utterly convinced that their reign, built on fear and firepower, was unshakable. They were kings, and Detroit was their kingdom. But as history has shown time and again, kingdoms built on sand and slaughter are the most fragile of all, and the very violence that forged their empire would soon ignite the fuse that would blow it all apart. The peak of the Purple Gang's power was a monument not to cunning, but to carnage, and its cornerstone was laid in the upscale Milaflores apartments on September 16, 1927. This event, known as the Milaflores Massacre, was the moment the Purples declared to the world that the old rules of gangland etiquette were dead, replaced by a new doctrine of indiscriminate, theatrical slaughter. The trouble began with a betrayal from within. 3 members of the gang, Joe Feed the Kids Lebovitz, Joe Soup Sutka, and Jaime the Miser Paul, had grown greedy, skimming profits from the gang's lucrative blind pig operation. In the Purple Gang's world, disloyalty had only one penalty. The 3 men were lured to apartment 211 at the Milaflores under the pretense of a business meeting. What awaited them was not negotiation, but a firing squad. As they sat, unsuspecting, Purple gunmen led by Sammy Cohen and Harry Keywell stepped from hiding and opened fire with Thompson submachine guns, turning the elegant apartment into a charnel house. The victims were shot to pieces, their bodies riddled with over 100 bullets. The brutality was excessive even for the era, but it was the aftermath that truly cemented the Purple's myth. They made no attempt to hide the crime. The bodies were left where they fell, a grisly calling card. More astonishingly, the gang used their immense influence to ensure complete legal immunity. Witnesses developed sudden amnesia. Evidence mysteriously vanished. The sole suspect briefly arrested, Abe Axler, was released after a conveniently lackluster prosecution. The message was received far beyond Detroit. The Purple Gang could commit mass murder in broad daylight and walk away untouched. This absolute power soon attracted the attention of the biggest player in the game, Al Capone. Chicago was in the throes of a brutal beer war between Capone and his North Side rivals, led by Bugs Moran. Capone needed a foolproof, deniable setup to eliminate Moran once and for all. He turned to the Purples, the masters of mechanized murder. According to extensive federal investigations and underworld law, it was the Purple Gang, specifically Abe Bernstein, who facilitated the infamous St. Valentine's Day massacre. They provided the crucial insider information, the tip about a shipment of hijacked Canadian whiskey arriving at Moran's Clark Street garage on February 14, 1929. More critically, they supplied the 2 key elements: the specialized, police-style uniforms and badges used by the assassins to lull Moran's men into a false sense of security, and potentially even some of the gunmen themselves. While Moran narrowly escaped, his organization was decimated. The Purple Gang had just played a pivotal role in the most infamous gangland hit in American history, and their stock in the underworld soared to unimaginable heights. They were now national figures, the go-to outfit for impossible, bloody jobs. Back in Detroit, their control became totalitarian. They terrorized witnesses into silence with such effectiveness that convictions were impossible. They corrupted the entire justice system, from beat cops to judges. Their bootlegging operation was a model of brutal efficiency, running like a Fortune 500 company with a homicide department. They even had a famous front, the Thomas Bookie Joint, a lavish horse racing wire service that was the social hub for the city's elite and underworld alike. But this zenith was also the beginning of their twilight. The Milaflores Massacre, while demonstrating their power, also exposed their fatal flaw: an addiction to overkill, a belief that any problem could be solved with more bullets. They began to turn on each other, paranoia festering in the inner circle. The once unbreakable loyalty forged on Hastings Street eroded in a flood of money and cocaine. Younger, hungrier members chafed under the Bernstein brothers' leadership. And outside, forces were finally mobilizing. The sheer, brazen violence of the Purples, once their greatest asset, had become a political liability too great for even their paid protectors to ignore. The public was outraged. Federal pressure, which had been focused on Chicago and Capone, began to shift toward Detroit. The Purple Gang, drunk on their own invincibility, failed to see the walls closing in. They were too busy celebrating their role in shaping American crime history, unaware that the very notoriety they cultivated was drafting their own death warrant. The empire was about to crack, not from an external invasion, but from a catastrophic internal explosion of greed, distrust, and the same unchecked rage that had built it. The downfall of the Purple Gang was not a single bullet but a slow, relentless poisoning from within, a cancer of their own creation. The first tremors came from the very heart of their operation, a bitter and violent rift over money, power, and respect that shattered the gang's myth of brotherhood. The old guard, led by the calculating Abe Bernstein, believed in maintaining a semblance of order and focusing on the lucrative, if bloody, business of bootlegging and racketeering. But a new, more volatile faction emerged, led by the younger, cocaine-fueled, and pathologically violent members like Harry Fleischer and the already notorious Harry Keywell. These young Turks grew impatient with the Bernstein's cautious approach. They craved more action, more flash, and a bigger cut of the profits. This internal tension turned deadly in a series of internecine murders that became known as the Purple Gang's Civil War. Gangsters who had once fought side by side now eyed each other with suspicion, fingers itching near their pistol grips. The fragile peace finally exploded over a seemingly minor dispute involving the gang's lucrative wire service for bookmakers. In 1930, Harry Millman, a key Purple associate, was gunned down. While officially unsolved, the whispers pointed squarely at the gang's own internal purge. The violence escalated. The gang's once impenetrable code of silence, known as omerta, began to crack under the weight of fear and betrayal. Members started talking, not to the police at first, but to each other in accusatory whispers, each murder breeding paranoia and the desire for preemptive revenge. This internal rot perfectly coincided with a monumental external shift, the fall of their greatest ally and customer, Al Capone. With Capone imprisoned for tax evasion in 1931, the gang lost not only a colossal revenue stream but also a powerful symbolic shield. The federal government, having tasted blood with Capone, now turned its full attention to other glaring targets, and the Purple Gang, with its spectacular record of violence and political corruption, was next on the list. The Hoover administration, desperate for a win during the Great Depression, declared war on organized crime, and Detroit was a prime battlefield. The Purples, however, were too blinded by their own internal strife to notice the changing tides. They continued to operate with the same brazen arrogance, culminating in the event that would finally provide the law with an unassailable, high-profile case: the brutal murder of a man named Sol Levine in 1931. Levine was a small-time independent bookmaker who had the temerity to refuse paying tribute to the Purples for his wire service. He was kidnapped, tortured for days, and eventually executed. This crime, while routine for the Purples, had a fatal flaw: it was witnessed. And not just by underworld figures, but by ordinary citizens who were no longer too terrified to speak. More importantly, it gave federal agents from the Bureau of Prohibition a clear, personal vendetta, as Levine was a friend of one of their investigators. The law began to close in with a new, scientific precision, building cases not on street gossip but on financial records and telephone wiretaps. The final, self-inflicted wound came from the most unexpected place: a children's party. In 1933, with Prohibition repealed and their core business evaporating, the Purples were scrambling for new revenue. They turned to kidnapping, targeting wealthy businessmen. One such victim was a man named William R. Willie Raskin. The kidnapping was bungled from the start, and the subsequent investigation led police directly to key Purple members. But the coup de grace was delivered by the gang themselves. On September 22, 1933, three of the gang's most feared enforcers, Harry Keywell, Irving Milberg, and Phil Keywell, committed a crime so stupidly brutal it defied all logic. They attempted to kidnap another racketeer, John Jake the Barber Factor, the brother of cosmetics magnate Max Factor, but ended up murdering an innocent bystander, a man named Julius Joni Heller, in broad daylight on a crowded Detroit street. The murder weapon was, of course, a Thompson submachine gun. This act of public terrorism finally broke the city's back. A massive manhunt ensued. The Keywell brothers and Milberg were captured, and this time, the Purple Gang's magic failed. Their influence had waned, the public's tolerance had vanished, and the federal government was now fully involved. In a stunning courtroom reversal, witnesses actually testified. For the first time, the Purple Gang's intimidation tactics didn't work. Harry Keywell, Irving Milberg, and Phil Keywell were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The myth of invincibility was shattered. One by one, the pillars of the empire fell. Gang members were picked up on charges ranging from tax evasion, the same weapon that felled Capone, to kidnapping and murder. The Bernstein brothers, the strategic brains of the operation, were finally convicted in 1937 for their role in the Raskin kidnapping and sent to Alcatraz. The once mighty Purple Gang, which had dictated terms to Capone and held a city in thrall, was now a collection of broken men in prison cells, snitching on each other to secure lighter sentences. Their empire, built in a dizzying 5-year ascent, had taken only about 3 years to completely implode. They were defeated not by a rival mob, but by their own unsustainable savagery, a federal government they had arrogantly underestimated, and the fatal decay of the very bonds that had once made them strong. The streets of Detroit were quieter, but the legacy of their violence echoed in the methods of every gang that followed. The final chapter of the Purple Gang is not one of redemption or quiet retirement, but a haunting echo of violence that trailed its members to their graves, a testament to the inescapable fate they had crafted for themselves. With the core leadership imprisoned in places like Alcatraz, Jackson State Penitentiary, and Marquette Branch Prison, the once formidable syndicate disintegrated into a ghost of its former self, surviving only in the fearful whispers of Detroit's history. But the story does not end with cells and bars. It ends as it began, in blood. The survivors, those not behind walls, found themselves adrift in a world that had moved on. Prohibition was over, and the new criminal empires were being built on narcotics and labor racketeering, enterprises that required a patience and subtlety the Purples never possessed. Their brand of raw, public terror was obsolete. Some, like a few of the lesser associates, faded into obscurity, living under assumed names, forever looking over their shoulders. But for the key figures, the men whose names had once struck fear into an entire city, there was no peaceful exit. Abe Bernstein, the strategic mastermind, served his time in Alcatraz for kidnapping and was released in the 1950s, a broken man. He returned to Detroit a phantom, living quietly and in constant fear until his death from natural causes in 1968, a rare, quiet end in a saga defined by gunfire. His brother Ray met a similar, subdued fate. But for others, the violence they had traded in for so long came calling to collect its final debt. Harry Fleischer, one of the volatile younger members, was murdered in 1942, gunned down in a Detroit street in a killing that bore all the hallmarks of a final, lingering grudge from the gang's internal wars. Perhaps the most symbolic and pitiful end was that of Sammy the Killer Cohen, the man who had helped orchestrate the Milaflores Massacre. Once a figure of immense fear, Cohen degenerated into a paranoid, lonely figure. In 1959, he was found dead in a seedy Los Angeles hotel room, ruled a suicide from a drug overdose, a far cry from the machine gun glory he had once chased. The legacy of the Purple Gang, however, extended far beyond the fates of its individual members. They had fundamentally altered the architecture of American organized crime. They proved the terrifying efficacy of the submachine gun as a tool of psychological and physical domination, a lesson eagerly adopted by every major syndicate that followed. They demonstrated that ethnic boundaries in crime were meaningless in the face of sheer brutality, paving the way for more diverse, ruthless coalitions. Their role as the wholesale suppliers to Chicago cemented the logistical networks that would outlast Prohibition. And their absolute corruption of a major city's institutions served as a dark blueprint and a stark warning. Yet, for all their impact, they remain a curious anomaly, a meteor that burned white-hot and vanished, lacking the multi-generational dynasty of the Italian mafia or the corporate longevity of the Chicago outfit. Their story is a pure, unadulterated parable of the American dream inverted. Immigrant ambition twisted by hardship into monstrous form, achieving spectacular success through sheer will and violence, only to be consumed by the very forces that created it. They were a product of a specific, perfect storm: poverty, prohibition, geographic opportunity, and a pre-FBI law enforcement landscape they could easily manipulate. When those conditions changed, they had no foundation upon which to build a lasting enterprise, only a mountain of corpses and a reservoir of hatred. Today, the physical remnants of their empire are gone, the Milaflores apartments demolished, the Hastings Street neighborhood erased by urban renewal. But their myth persists in books, in documentaries, and in the darker corners of Detroit's folklore. They are remembered not with the romanticized nostalgia sometimes afforded to other gangsters, but with a sobering awe at the sheer scale of their savagery and the breathtaking speed of their self-destruction. They were the ultimate independent contractors of fear, who believed their firepower made them untouchable gods, forgetting that in the world they created, there was always someone younger, hungrier, and just as willing to pull the trigger. Their rise and fall stands as one of the most compelling and cautionary tales in the annals of crime, a reminder that power seized through terror is a contract written in disappearing ink, destined to vanish the moment the fear stops, leaving behind nothing but echoes of gunshots and a question: what was it all for? In the end, the Purple Gang did not lose to a rival. They were defeated by the inherent, unsustainable logic of their own existence. They were a fire that burned too fiercely, consuming its own fuel until only ashes remained, scattered on the winds of time, a dark purple stain on the history of a city that can never quite forget the shadow they cast. If this journey into the brutal heart of the Purple Gang has gripped you, if the tales of their terrifying rise and spectacular fall have sent a chill down your spine, then you understand why this story must be told and remembered. This narrative was assembled from the fragments of history to bring you the unvarnished truth. We have a duty to learn from these dark chapters. So, if you believe in preserving this raw history, help us keep these stories alive. Subscribe to the channel right now. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a deep dive into the forgotten truths of our past. Like this video, share it with someone who appreciates real, unfiltered history, and let us know in the comments below, which other infamous criminal empire should we unravel next? Your engagement fuels our research and allows us to bring more shocking, meticulously sourced stories from the shadows into the light. Thank you for listening. Stay curious, and remember, history is not just about dates and kings. It's about the people, the choices, and the echoes that shape our world long after they are gone.